I'm Mark Crispin Miller. Welcome to this month's News from Underground. Tonight's panel is on the highly relevant topic of debt, student debt, and debt in general, because the expansion plan will be paid for by more student debt, which, as we've argued, is both precarious and immoral. And it raises larger questions about debt itself, which is the subject of the panel. So I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague Andrew Ross, who, like myself, is a member of NYU faculty against the Sexton Plan, and he will then introduce the panelists. Let me just make two quick mercenary points. One is that this is an independent bookstore, and these are independent authors, some of whom have brought books of theirs, and I encourage you to buy copies of their books so you can actually have the authors sign them if you're inclined to have a signed copy. The other point is that NYU faculty against the Sexton Plan is allied with the community, stands shoulder to shoulder with the people of Greenwich Village to fight the NYU expansion plan, not just because it threatens to destroy a particular neighborhood in Greenwich Village, but also because it represents a serious threat to every neighborhood in New York City. In approving this plan on July 25th, the City Council set a devastating precedent for every neighborhood that could be overbuilt in all 5 boroughs. We therefore have retained a law firm. We're serious about stopping this thing for the sake of the entire city, and have teamed up with neighborhood groups from Harlem to Brooklyn to Queens, all over Manhattan, and so on. So at the end, I'm going to ask you if you'll consider making a donation to our legal fund. Having said all that, let me turn this over to Andrew.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark announced, both Mark and I are involved in a campaign against our employer, which in this kind of economy is pretty risky business, unless you have tenure, which both of us do have. Probably one of the last 2 or 3 generations to have it. And I just wanted to reiterate Mark's call for those of you who want to support the campaign. It's important not just for this community, downtown Manhattan, but for New York City as a whole. And we did a panel on this in this series in the spring, and the owner of McNally Bookstore, McNally Jackson Bookstore, very generously offered to publish a book in support of the cause, and it's on sale here, right, presumably this evening. It's a book penned by Greenwich Village authors. And one of the tie-ins to tonight's panel topic, one of the more direct tie-ins, is that the growth of urban universities, like NYU and Columbia and the New School in this town, at least, growth of these universities is very heavily debt financed. And the more and more that universities fall under the orbit of the financial industry, the more and more they're becoming debt machines, generating debt in all kinds of directions for everybody involved. And I think in the public mind there's still this perception that universities are a kind of haven from the heartless world of financialization. But that, I think, is far from true, certainly in my experience and a lot of the experience of folks who are involved in that sector, higher education sector. And it is indeed the case that, especially in the instance of student debt, higher education is a sector that's very rapidly and very efficiently delivering its customers into lifelong debt bondage. Like the panelists on this, panelists to the right of me, I've been very involved in anti-debt organizing over the last several months at least, and as a result, debt has become the lens through which I see everything. You know, that's what happens when you do single issue organizing. That said, I am hopeful that many of you in the audience would agree that our current debt crisis is one of the most serious challenges on our doorstep. And the current levels of debt, whether they're household debt, public debt, sovereign debt, corporate debt, municipal debt, they're all massively unsustainable and will never be paid off, can never be paid off in our lifetime. And when a society reaches a point at which its creditor class is allowed to deliver its citizenry into debt bondage, then that's a very critical point. Something has to give. And so we reached that point, I think, and that's one of the backdrops to this panel this evening. We're very lucky to have 3 authors who have thought long and hard about this topic on our behalf, and they're going to take on the topic this evening. And let me introduce them. To my immediate right is Anya Kamenetz. She's a senior writer at Fast Company magazine and the author of several books about the future of education, most notably Generation Debt, 2006, and DIYU, Edupunkts, Edupreneurs, and the Coming Transformation of Higher Education, 2010. She's also published 2 ebooks that are available for free. One is called Learning, Freedom on the Web, available through the Mozilla Foundation, and the other one is the Edupunkts Guide, available through the Gates Foundation. Pamela Brown, to her right, is one of the bright lights of the Occupy movement. She's an activist with the Occupy Student Debt Campaign and also with Occupy Strike Debt Assembly. She's a doctoral candidate in sociology at the New School for Social Research, and she blogs at emission-control.net. And thirdly, George Caffentzis is a philosopher of money, which is a wonderful title, philosopher of money at the University of Southern Maine, as a coordinator of the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa. George co-edited a book called 1,000 Flowers, Social Struggles Against Structural Adjustment in African Universities, 2000. He's also the author of a book about John Locke's philosophy of money, which is entitled Clipped Coins, Abused Words and Civil Government. We're going to start with George this evening, and then Anya will speak, and Pam will speak third. So, George, please.
Yeah, we've all agreed to speak about 10 minutes or so, and to start the conversation going. I think that this is really the idea. And I just wanted to say, I think the series is Notes from the Underground, but actually the issues that we're talking about now are very much coming from the underground into the forefront of political life here in the United States. And not only in terms of the question of mortgage debt and student debt and national debt, but in terms of the whole question of the financial system that thrives upon this debt. So, yeah, okay, yeah, I know. Here, let me see if I can do it this way, okay? So what I thought I would do tonight is to help put a framework about this issue of debt, and most importantly, not the aspect of getting into debt, but getting out, of beginning to refuse debt. And this is part of a political project that I think all of us have been involved in the panel over the last few years, and especially in this last year with the Occupy movement. And I think that the history of debt resistance is very long and noble. And it's not alien. It's not something that they do in South America alone, although there's much debt resistance there. It's not only what they did in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where there were revolutions upon revolutions of debtors who had been enslaved and then fought back with arms to liberate themselves from debt bondage and debt slavery. But also, here in the United States, the history of debt resistance is very much wrapped up in the history of the political forces that shape this place. And I think in the next few weeks and months, we're going to see that this type of effect of debt refusal, debt resistance on the larger political life of the country. So I'd like to just sketch for a few minutes, and please, Andrew, and make sure that I don't permit you to start on history. Every story follows another, and there's always a temptation to go ever. So I just wanted to, let me just speak about 3 different episodes in debt refusal that took place here in the United States. In fact, the first one in 1786 is almost coeval with the formation of the Republic, the American Republic. It was Shays' Rebellion, and what happened in Shays' Rebellion in 1786 was that farmers in western Massachusetts were in debt to Boston merchants and bankers, or early forms of bankers. And they were increasingly finding themselves, in fact, for their land was foreclosed upon, and because they couldn't pay their debts. And increasingly they began to realize that the situation was such that within a very short time, the land that they fought for in the revolution would be taken away from them. So there was slowly what begins to happen is that bands of farmers form outside of courts that are doing basically doing the deliberations that would create the foreclosures, and attempted to stop the courts from operating. And of course, there was confrontation. The militias were brought out to fight these farmers, and in fact, many of these militias went over to the farmers' side. So in the heated period of the spring and summer of 1786, there was in effect, a rebellion. In fact, it's called Daniel Shays' Rebellion, after one of the leaders of the rebellion. And basically, what was it that they wanted? And Henry Knox, one of the major figures of the American elite at that time, in writing to George Washington, said, this is what they wanted. This is how they argued, that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice, and ought to be swept off the face of the earth. So this is what Knox says, this is what they wanted, okay? And Knox added in his own words, in a word, they are determined to annihilate all debts, public and private, and have agrarian laws which are easily effected by means of unfunded paper money, which shall be tender in all cases whatsoever. So this is this rebellion failed in one sense, but it had a tremendous impact. On the one side, it led to the formation of the Constitution. It's a well-known connection has been made between the terror that was struck in the heart of the elite of the American Republic when they saw that here were these veterans who were beginning to take the economic life of the Republic in their own hands. And basically the Massachusetts militia was in fact for Shays' Rebellion, and therefore they recognized that it would be important to have an armed force that was not associated with any particular part of the country. So in fact, they recognized the necessity for a central state beyond the type of confederacy that was formed immediately after the revolution. So Shays' Rebellion shows us that one of the themes that I think is very important to recognize in the history of debt resistance you don't always win. In fact, rarely do you win what you say you're going to get. But on the other side, the power of what you're doing has tremendous consequences. And I'm not saying we're not going to win our struggles, right? But I'm saying we have to remember what our struggles reflect and what we can bring to bear, what forces we can bring to bear to transform life here in the United States. Let me just, how are we doing with time? Okay. Yeah, let me just fast forward to after the Civil War to the next stage of the struggle around debt and the organizations that were formed in the 1880s and 1890s to fight against the foreclosure and eviction that was taking place mostly in the South and Midwest by farmers. This brought together and created what is now known as the populist movement. And basically the populist movement should be, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of scholarship about this movement because it seems to reflect the rhetoric of much of the Occupy movement of today. The key to the populist movement was the demand to end these types of foreclosures that were taking place all across the South and Midwest during the latter part of the 19th century. And if we want to hear one of the firebrands of that movement, we can hear the words of Mary Elaine Lease in a speech that she gave before the Populist Party convention. She said, "Wall Street owns this country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street." And she added, prefiguring our movement right now, 120 years ago, she said, "We want money, land, and transportation. We want the abolition of the national banks, as we want the power to make loans directly from the government. We want the accursed foreclosure system wiped out, and we will not pay our debts to the loan shark companies until the government pays its debts to us." Okay, that is, I think we can perhaps quote it verbatim. It sounds really Quran, okay? Of course, in the Great Depression, there was also a tremendous amount of debt resistance, both in the cities to resist evictions and in the rural areas to resist foreclosure on farms. And in fact, there were many self-help organizations that attempted to, in various ways, resist the foreclosures. One of the most famous ones, and in fact, it's a little bit reminiscent of one of the tactics that we're using called the Rolling Jubilee, which is called the penny auction. The penny auction being the following. When a farmer had his land foreclosed upon, often the banks would then create an auction to basically to sell this land, okay? And what basically the farming community where this farmer was part of would flock to the auction, more or less intimidate those who would want to put a high bid, and eventually create a situation where the only bid that was put forward was a penny, or $1. But it would be a trivial sum. And so at the end of the day, the land would be rebought by the farmer directly at for example, $5 for the land that had been, and the farmer would therefore have not only the land back, but without a mortgage. Now, again, that particular strategy went so far, and of course there were many ways in which this was stopped, but throughout the history of the United States, coming up to the present day, we see that there have been very powerful movements of debt resistance. And I want to say we are now clearly at another moment, a very important moment. in this story. Because after the Second World War, something happens in terms of the notion of collateral for loans. For a long period of time in the United States, most of the people I've been talking about here in terms of debt resistance were small farmers. Okay? And the reason why they were able to take out loans is because they had land as collateral. Now, what begins to happen in after the Second World War especially, is that the wage of the average worker was increasingly seen as an acceptable form of collateral. If someone had a quote-unquote good job, if they could guarantee their future earnings, this could be the basis of taking out a loan either for a home, for an automobile, or for refrigerators or whatever you might need for a home. Now this type of collateral continued, this kind of conception of what it is to have a loan continued up until relatively recently. And increasingly now we're beginning to discover that, of course, the wage is guaranteed and secure no longer. This means that the whole regime that had been formed around debt and the wage to working class in the United States is now undergoing a profound transformation. And I'd like to talk about that as we go along. So thank you.
Thanks for that. That was really fascinating. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out, and thanks to Andrew for inviting me, and to Mark, and thanks to Pam for her work. So I'm a journalist, and sort of by accident, my whole career has been shaped around this issue of student debt and the effects that it's having, which are very massive and complex. And it turns out that I can pick up the story kind of right where you left off, because you're talking about, okay, in the post-war era, we sort of shifted from collateralized debt to maybe debt that's based on wages. And the really interesting thing about the student debt movement, student debt regime or system that we have right now is it's not just debt based on wages, but it's debt based on your potential and your brain. And they became this very deep connection between education, which is sort of the bedrock of the American dream. If you work hard, if you play by the rules, if you're smart, you're going to get chosen, and you're going to be able to work your way up and be in the middle class. And that got suddenly attached with a huge asterisk, which is you're also going to be carrying this huge debt into your life. So that's really bizarre. And it started kind of by accident, actually. So 1965 was really the Higher Education Act. Johnson really wanted to expand access to higher education. It was the second great expansion after the GI Bill. And it was a really massive bill that created all kinds of student aid programs. But in the first reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, a movement came up before Congress to say, well, we need some kind of aid to families who have maybe more than one kid that they're going to be putting through college at the same time. Why don't we offer a tax credit to those families? And then other people in Congress said, oh, tax credit's kind of expensive. Why don't we create a low-interest loan, government loan program instead for those families, and then they'll pay it off by the time they get their tax refund, because it's very small amounts we're talking about. But the creation of this federal student loan program just opened up a Pandora's box, because all of a sudden it became possible to finance a higher education. And this was accelerated with the creation of the Student Loan Marketing Agency, a government-sponsored entity, Sallie Mae, in 1972 by Nixon. Again, I think with some positive intentions to say, okay, well, we're going to, make sure that the banks are leery of making these loans to families, and so the Sallie Mae is going to be a secondary market for these loans. The banks are going to make them to families because they'll then be able to turn around and resell the debt to Sallie Mae, and Sallie Mae is going to buy them up. And that was the foundation of the system that we all know and despise today, right? The availability of this debt allowed states, when they were in a pinch, and this especially was true in the 1970s, as demographically that there was a birth dearth, the number of young people went down, college enrollment actually went down for the first time in American history in the 1970s. A lot of colleges had overbuilt themselves in the 60s. They'd been expanding. They had great plans. And all of a sudden, the receipts were not as high as they'd been. So they went and started to raise tuition. And then state said, oh, we have so many other things we'd like to fund. Higher education, what we can do is we can raise the tuition, and then the money comes from the federal government. It doesn't come directly from our budgets. And so there became a very tight relationship between state spending less money on higher education and a cost shift that took place towards students spending more. And that cost shift was ultimately paid for by financing, more and more and more financing, more and more and more debt. And that is how we got into the predicament that we're in today, where, and this happened actually really quickly. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. So in the early 90s, less than half of all students graduated with debt. It's really not that long ago, and today it's 2/3 of students graduating with student debt. We have 36 million Americans with student debt. You probably heard there's $1 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. And what I think is really remarkable and really kind of frightening is how much it's picked up just in the last couple of years. Since the financial crisis in 2008, people have stopped borrowing in a lot of ways. They've paid down credit card debt. They're much more cautious about buying. Home prices stayed low for a long time. They're paying down their household debt. They're borrowing less money even for cars. But student loan debt has continued to increase, and the default rate has continued to rise. It's actually rising at a really alarming rate, both of those things. And it's not hard to understand why, because you have people graduating into the worst job market in 25 years, and all of a sudden they have this debt. But the really curious thing is that they feel like they don't have a choice, because, again, this goes back to this question of, what's the moral valence of this debt? And there's a lot of things in America that people feel like they shouldn't borrow money for, but the gospel on student loan debt has always been that it's good debt, and it's debt that will help you and that will carry you. It's always going to be worth something. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. So that's why, it leads people to this really terrible situation where they feel like they've taken everybody's advice to do the right thing, and they've ended up sort of on the wrong end of things. But what I want to argue as well is that, student loan debt has distorted actually the whole project of higher education, more so than just the raw deal that students and graduates are getting. I think what Andrew alludes to is that universities has kind of turned their heads. Universities they've always had a lot of different leaders, a lot of different stakeholders that operate a university. And if you ask people what a university is for and what a university does, you'll get a different answer depending on whether you're talking to the faculty, the administration, the local leaders, the clergymen, the members of the local ethnic group, or the farmers that are being supported in that area, or anybody. Everybody's got a different idea of what a university is for. But now you have another stakeholder in the mix, and that is the people that lend the university money, that help the university borrow money and finance its expansion and finance its plans. And an example of this in the way that universities are kind of giving away the store to financial interests is happening right now with students and credit cards. So in the 90s, in the 2000s, up to 91% of undergraduate students carried a credit card. And these credit card companies marketed in this campus bookstores very, very close to the students with branded, university insignia on the cards. And they offer the freebies to the students in exchange for the cards. And students were graduating with, 4 figures of debt. About 1 in 4 students were putting actually their tuition on a credit card. So this is a really horrible situation, and actually it got smacked down in Congress, and they passed the Credit Card Act in 2009, making it illegal to, once again, as it had been in the 80s, for someone under 21 without a source of income to get a credit card on their own, regardless of whether they were a student or not. So, okay, you'd say, well, we legislated this away, students now need a cosigner, the problem is solved. But the temptation of having an alliance between the financial companies and the colleges was too great, actually. So they came up with another plan. And the plan was, and this was in a report that came out recently from the public interest research groups, what we're going to do is we're going to create prepaid debit cards. And these prepaid debit cards are going to be a partnership between your university and a Bank of America or Wells Fargo, a Citibank, and they're going to be your student ID. So your student ID is going to be also functioning as a prepaid debit card. And we're going to give you your financial aid directly on this card, okay? It is going to be so convenient, and you can use it all the time. You don't need to open a checking account, and you don't need to get a credit card, because if you need to get a credit card, you can, you need a cosigner and all of that. But the convenience of this is obviously totally illusory, because they're charging people $2 every time they use it. Every transaction is $2, okay? And the money that the school is lending you, your student loan money, which comes from the federal government, and the purpose of that money is to expand access to higher education, is going right back into the pockets of the banks for an undetermined consideration by the colleges. The colleges are getting some kind of promotional consideration, some kind of money out of the deal, and they're basically skimming. They're inserting themselves. The financial companies are once again inserting themselves into the relationship between, what we should be doing as public citizens, which is expanding access to education. So my feeling is that there are many different kinds of resistance. People fought really hard for that Credit Card Act and for legislation to prevent credit card companies from marketing to students, and the financial companies found a way around it. And so I'd like to suggest that, in what Pam's talking about, that we think really holistically and that we think really big, because when you talk about resisting debt, you kind of have to also talk about resisting the conditions that lead you to come into debt. And what are the conditions that lead to people getting into student loan debt? It's that higher education is extremely expensive, right? What makes higher education expensiveness so possible? It's the fact that there's debt. So there's a very circular relationship. In order to break out of that, I argue, and what this logic has led me to, is to say we need new alternatives for people to be able to learn and teach themselves outside of the system of an institution that can stand in the way of that, whether it's a financial institution or a university, and say, well, I'm sorry, you need to pay $50,000 a year in order to learn.
Okay, well, so I'm planning to talk a little bit about organizing around debt. And it's interesting that George and Anya brought these two particular forms of debt to light, with housing and student debt specifically. So I've been working with the Occupy Student Debt campaign for the last year, and now with Strike Debt Assembly, which is kind of a coalition that formed with Occupy Student Debt Campaign, Occupy Theory, and Free University. And with Occupy Student Debt Campaign, one of the interesting things was that when we started, I think that we are still, the only campaign that's not just challenging student debt, but the entire system, like Anya's talking about. And so the principles that we founded the campaign on were that public education should be free, again, if you're in New York, that private institutions should open their books, that the government shouldn't make a profit from student loans, so there should be no interest, zero interest, and that what we really need right now is a one-time jubilee of sorts so that we can wipe out student debt and start from zero, because we have 5 million people who are already in default. We have 41% of the class of 2005 either delinquent or in default. We have 2/3 of the current classes coming out of school with an average of $27,000 worth of debt. So we have a real problem. And over the year, as we've looked at the problem more and more, we found that this is across all forms of debt. It's not only really student debt, although that was our starting point. With housing debt, we've got 5 million homes already foreclosed. We should have about, the estimates are as high as 8 million by the time we're done with this thing. We have municipal debt. We have about $800 billion worth of credit card debt as well. So we have all of these different forms of debt. But we face challenges in organizing around the issue of debt. In our campaign, the first thing that we faced was sort of like the glazed over kind of look, like debt, like what is that? And we found pretty quickly that students who are accruing this debt right now don't really have a real connection to it. It's very abstract. So we face this problem of debt being a really abstract issue for people. But then even worse than that problem was that people have a real attachment to the morality of debt. They honestly believe 100% that no matter what, under no circumstance should they not pay. So those were the two really main challenges that we faced. And so I want to talk a little bit about why we should really organize around this issue in spite of the difficulties. And I think that we can actually use this NYU expansion plan as a great example of the ways in which debt really affect us all. I'm a student at the New School, and we've just been through what NYU is about to go through. If you go, if you're happening to walk down 14th Street and Fifth Avenue, you're going to find a huge building that's under construction right now. And that building was financed based on the school going into debt as they perceived it. And they perceived that the way to do that would be to raise tuition a modest 4 or 5% a year. So one of the problems is we all see, because of this abstraction around debt, we all see it a little bit differently. And the students saw that as an increase to their student debt, thanks, I think, a lot to OWS like really raising this issue, and began to resist this and began to say, you know, maybe I don't even want to do this program. Maybe, you know, I want to leave school. So enrollment actually went down. As opposed to the planned increase, because they were ever expanding, of course, ever increasing the amount of tuition, and they met resistance. So what did they do? They said that they had to then downsize. What they called downsizing means someone else going into credit card debt, because something like 3/4 of the time when someone loses their job, what they have to do is live on credit cards. So all of a sudden now you've got someone who's lost their job in this other form of debt, right? And then you have that person, maybe they're not able to find another job. I mean, people have been out of work long term in this job market, and so then they enter perhaps foreclosure. And if they're an African American, they're going to find themselves in pretty good company, because 50% of African American homeowners are expected to be foreclosed, with 25% already having been so. So, you know, and the cycle really continues. When we returned to classes last year, we found that we had fewer professors because one had retired in my department, and there was a hiring freeze. Unfortunately, the hiring freeze led to someone being hired and then not hired. And then we also had adjuncts who were hired and then they were not hired because there wasn't enough enrollment or there wasn't enough something, right? And so the impact of this is not just about the economics of debt, but also about the social relationships, the social bonds, what we owe each other. As a student, you come into school and you feel that you are owed a particular kind of education. You're told you're going to be in a seminar. You're promised that by individuals who take that promise seriously, and then they can no longer keep that promise to you. And your promise has been broken. This changes the relationship there. So that's the first reason that I would say that we do want to organize around debt. Debt affects us all. We may see it differently, but we're all caught in the same web. And I could do the same example in any direction. You can do it for yourselves and think through the sort of web of debt, the spiral of debt, the domino effect of all these types of debt sort of falling upon one another. And then the next reason is kind of interesting in light of what George and Anya were talking about, because it kind of falls in between this period. It kind of falls, for me at least, in what I've found out so far, in this period of post-depression kind of period in American history, where it's sort of interesting because the kind of mortgages that people actually had for farms, for homes, for everything, and only 40% of Americans had mortgages before the Great Depression, before the post-Depression era. And those mortgages were not structured the way mortgages today are, right? Mortgages then were around 3 to 5 years, and you had a balloon payment at the end. So you were paying interest during this period, and then you had to pay it all, which is why there was really such an incredibly high foreclosure rate. People couldn't do it over that period of time, and they lost their property. But after the Great Depression in 1934, we had the Housing Act, right? And what the Housing Act actually did was it created entities, Fannie Mae, and also Fannie Mae, which is the same kind of entity that was later created as Sallie Mae, so the Mae sisters or what have you. So with Fannie Mae was created for the express purpose of buying mortgages from the banks. So the idea was to incentivize banks by saying, you give the person the money and then we'll buy the mortgage from you as a secondary market, which led to our securitization today. The other thing that it did was it created the FHA, which then offered insurance so that they could increase the amount that you could have a mortgage for. In the past, you could only mortgage get a mortgage for maybe 50% of the property value, but immediately you started to be able to get 90%, and you started to be able to have loans that lasted 15 years, and then later on 30 years. So what happened during this period was that you had obviously you'd have the price of property increase, right? So I'm a little bit more cynical in terms of the creation of Sallie Mae because of this, because we saw exactly what happened. We knew when Sallie Mae was created that the end result of this was going to be that tuition increased astronomically. So those were kind of two reasons that I was thinking that we should really organize seriously around debt. And I guess I can conclude that reason by saying that this was really a partnership between the banks and the government. It's not as if we can petition the government and say, let's make it some kind of change to our laws and policies very easily, because this is an embedded relationship. This is a very deeply held partnership that was created to create a certain kind of society after the Depression, when people were really agitating around debt refusal and issues like this. And we can see the results, because we can see that with the student loan issues, we have great organizations like Student Loan Justice, for example, that have been working for years to just get bankruptcy protection restored in the case, that you, God forbid, get hit by a bus. I mean, really serious case, you cannot get bankruptcy. You can't have bankruptcy protection for student loans. And we can also see this with the housing crisis, because of course everyone said we have to do something. We have to do some kind of principal write-down. We're going to give money to the banks so that they can bail out the homeowners. And what happened? We still have 8 million foreclosures. So this is, for me, one of the main reasons to organize around debt, because it really strikes at this system, this interconnectedness, and it's really our only place to kind of push back against it. The other point is kind of, what are the other options? And I don't know that there are very many. We've seen movements for a long time now around issues of class, of race, of gender, labor movements, and we've actually ended up over time in terms of disparity in a worse situation. So they haven't really been successful yet. So what we've tried to do is create Strike Debt and the Occupy Student Debt Campaign. The Occupy Student Debt Campaign, you can sign the petition, and we're collectivizing 1 million people to resist student loan debt by a symbolic action, predominantly because the system is such that it really is symbolic. But it would, at least theoretically, withhold $27 billion from the system. And it could be successful because of the power of 1 million people coming together and saying we're really refusing this system. I think that would be a very powerful action. And then we're also working on Strike Debt Assembly, or just Strike Debt now, I suppose. We've evolved to Strike Debt, where we have we've put together a manual called the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, which can help individuals defend themselves against all the different debt relationships. We are working on what George mentioned, this rolling jubilee, where we will be able to basically act as debt fairies and buy people's debt. More on that in the future. And we're also looking at ways to create a real resistance movement around a form of union, becoming some kind of a union. We don't have the exact details of that yet, but we are in the process of working on that. And I just invite you all to join us and to join the fight. Come to our meetings, which are normally on Sundays at 12 noon at Washington Square Park, although this week we will be meeting at 1:30 in Williamsburg.
So this is a really great start. It gave us a lot of depth and breadth, lots of dimensions on the topic. I just wanted to invite any of the three speakers to add comments in the light of what anyone else on the panel said.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Anya first, but perhaps all of us. What seems to be at this moment a very contradictory development in terms of this particular last couple of years. On the one side, almost everybody has received the message. Your wages are precarious. They're not secure. Almost any job is vulnerable. Perhaps funeral director might not be, because you've got to be there, I suppose. But with the few exceptions, you're facing, whether you're a material laborer or worker or an immaterial worker, if you accept that distinction, both kinds of workers are very vulnerable. And if you plan to think that you have any kinds of guarantees looking towards 10, 20 years in the future, forget it. This is what we're being told, right? And at the same time, we're being told the only way to escape is by going to university, and somehow that particular act is going to get you out of this stranglehold. Now, I'm asking myself, and I'm asking you, Anya, who presented this startling fact, what is going on? I need to know, because
It's not a Marvin Gaye question.
and I'd like to hear
No,
what you've got to say.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I wanted to answer this too, and so I wrote DIYU to kind of answer this for myself, and got to the point of saying basically, we got two really contrasting ideals in America. One is democracy and one is meritocracy. In the democratic ideal, we have equality, and in a socialist democratic ideal, it's not just equality of opportunity, but it's equality of outcome, and we sort of ensure a certain floor and a certain level of security for people. But in America, we're not entirely cool with that. We don't have that socialist ideal. It's not as strong. It's one strand, but it's not the dominant strand. And so we have this meritocracy, which is basically equality of opportunity, and whoever is the best is going to get out there on top and win. And so we exalt this ideal of social mobility and say, anybody can become anything without, social mobility is great on the way when the Ferris wheel's going this way, but then it starts going this way, then you're like a little bit scared, right? That's what precariousness is, because you're moving around a lot and the volatility that people are experiencing is huge. So education is the thing that on the right and the left people agree is an okay way to promote equality. We're going to promote equality through education. So it's equality through hard work, equality through opportunity, and we're going to save the best people. And I think Thomas Jefferson wrote about, we're going to rake up the precious stones or the diamonds out of the rubble. So he founded the University of Virginia because he wanted to say, we're going to provide opportunity to the sons of laborers and sons of farmers, provided that they themselves, obviously they're sons and they're white, but they are talented and they're smart, and therefore they're going to deserve a chance, right? And that's kind of how we talk about it even today. And we don't talk about, well, what if you don't deserve a chance? And what if you get that chance and your chance goes by? Or what if that chance comes with this huge price tag, which is kind of what we're talking about now? So yeah, I mean, that's a really rough situation.
Yeah, I also, just to add to that, I think we also need to address some of the actual statistical facts, which is that we talk about this meritocracy, but one does not now and really hasn't ever actually existed. An interesting fact is that if you're born to the bottom 20th percentile income-wise in this country, you have less than a 4% or less than a 5% chance of earning over $60,000 a year. So you basically are unable to even make it into the middle class. So I think that looking at the issue of education, this is why having a free public education system is so important, because we look at the fight that's happening now at City University, or that was lost really, over what many people who are NYU students would probably say it was a relatively small tuition increase. We're talking about $300, I think, a year. But this was actually an amount of money that could prevent someone from being able to access education, under the belief, at least, that that would help them to get out of the economic condition that they were born in. And the truth is that it does really bear out that you do have greater security with a college education across the board and lower unemployment. So there is a certain reality to it too, I guess.
Okay, from the audience, let's take questions. Yes, it's back.
This is actually in response to what I didn't hear. So I'd love for you to respond to what I didn't hear. First of all, income-based repayment, 80% of Americans are who qualify for income-based repayment have no idea that they are qualified for income-based repayment. I didn't hear about regulation of for-profit proprietary institutions to take full advantage of low-income students. I didn't hear about the fact that 2/3 of individuals who are low-income in community colleges defaulted in 2010, which has long-term implications for their economic stability and being able to build assets over time. The other thing I didn't hear about was, God forbid, outcomes-based accountability. Meaning, and I'm not talking about performance-based accountability, but I'm saying tying the funding to outcomes with respect to graduation rates, with respect to completion rates, with respect to students being able to have some form of a job with a high quality job with labor market value. I didn't hear that at all. So any responses to any of those issues?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I think we're really guilty probably of, like, this was an NYU and New School inflected panel, so we kind of talked about the problem from the point of view of people that pay $50,000 a year to go to school. But actually, yeah, the burden of student loan debt falls much more heavily on the 80% of students that attend public institutions and the half of American undergraduates who attend community colleges. And most of all, 1 in 10 students attend for-profit colleges. 1 in 10 American college students attend for-profit colleges. Yet those colleges account for half of all student loan defaults. That is because they charge too much money and they don't care what happens to you once you sign up. There's a revolving door. The Congress concluded in a report that came out earlier this year that people leave those colleges with an average of 4 months. And they get there, they have, so the student loan problem, affects people with a degree, but like Pamela said, if you have a degree, you have a really big leg up. What about the people with no degree and debt? So the last point that you brought up is this gainful employment, right? Gainful employment rule, which was heavily watered down. Congress presented a regulation saying, right now what the law says, more or less, if you have a for-profit college, and if that for-profit college, at least 30% of the people that graduate from your college have to be able to pay back their debts. That means 2/3 cannot. And that makes you a legitimate college that is eligible then for receiving 90% of your funds from the federal government, because those for-profit institutions receive 90% of their funds from the federal government gainful employment rule needs to be extended to all colleges and universities and made much more stringent. This is something, by the way, that faculty members at straight-up institutions, at public institutions, private institutions, don't necessarily support because they see it as an infringement of academic freedom and an unholy alliance of looking at outcomes and wages of people that leave their institution is an infringement on their freedom to teach what they want to teach the way they want to teach it. So that's a really huge battleground, I think, that might be glossed over, but probably an important conversation to have. And getting back to the first part that you said, yes, there are very important programs, income-based repayment, income contingent repayment, public service loan forgiveness, that are massively undersubscribed. And you guys should all look into them if you think that you have trouble paying back your loans.
Well, I guess I think I need to take this one. So I guess I would just ask you, I think all of the points that you just raised were great and important points. So do you feel that the system is really about education based on the reality, the facts that you just presented to us?
I think the important word you just said there is system. So I think it's important for us to think very carefully about how we change the system itself in terms of regulatory policy, in terms of policies related to how we fund college universities, how we actually, in fact, rethink delivery. I just think there are a lot of things that higher education can learn from that at least K through 12 at least made an attempt to in terms of thinking about reforming itself. Because right now I don't think higher education has really been serious about reform. So it's not just about the system change, which needs to happen, but at the same time, which is why I brought up outcomes-based funding, is that I think that higher education needs to think seriously about how they rethink themselves in terms of how they want to deliver programs. It makes no sense whatsoever, I don't think, if you're an art history major, nothing wrong with art history, but where in fact we say that people all the time, well, you have to get a 4-year degree. Well, there's nothing wrong with encouraging people to go to technical colleges and universities to get a high quality education where they can actually get a job with later market value. I'm not saying that that's a whole other big issue, I know, but the fact of the matter is the notion that everyone has to have a 4-year degree, I think, is something that is detrimental to some, and we have to be very careful about issues of tracking and things of that nature, but I think that's a conversation we need to have. I know that's like anathema in the village.
That's why I wrote DIYU, and I kind of grope all through that and try to get into that. I'm not trying to plug my book. Like, you can read the EduPunk's Guide for free and talk about ways to educate yourself, and I talk about certifications and alternative forms of education. It is, you run smack into the issue that people see higher education in so many different ways for so many different reasons and meanings. And if you're just walking into it saying, I'm going to try to get this degree to be able to get a job, that is a slice of it that's really, really important, especially to people without a lot of means. And yet it's only one piece of this overall picture. And I think reforming delivery is very, very important. But when you get into questions of accountability that again run back into questions of academic freedom, and it's just it's a very large conversation. But I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, just to respond to that, we live in a democracy, and education, one of the most important things we're supposed to believe in a democracy is that citizens should be informed in order to participate in democracy, and our education system actually serves a very vital role just in the operation of the society. It's not just about people getting jobs. But I think what's happened in this country is that high school and I guess that's secondary education, has fallen so flat in terms of preparing citizens to be citizens that you basically have to go get a 4-year degree in order to be able to think. That's sort of understood by employers But that's sort of a different issue. I mean, the reason why a 4-year degree is now so key to employment is because I think that same issue.
I mean, 4 years, we're behind the curve here. We're not talking about 4 years anymore. The given wisdom is that you need a master's degree to be employable in the knowledge economy. I mean, that's the message that's sent out loud and clear in universities across this country by college administrations.
Yeah.
And master's programs are really the most predatory in terms of screwing students over and mounting debt burdens. There's very little financial aid available, hardly any, in master's programs, and they're very, very costly indeed. So let's not talk about 4 years at this point. They really have upped the ante.
Well, but by the same token, you know, it's a very diverse market. 37% of people with an associate's degree earn more than the average of people with a bachelor's degree. People in those technical fields, people with RNs, you know, licensed practical nurses, people, you know, are highly skilled machine operators. There are lots of segments of the market, if you're smart enough and able enough to get into them, that can pay more. And by the same token, the percentage of graduate students and people with PhDs, this was reported last year, who are on food stamps has tripled, right? So there is no one-on-one connection, and there shouldn't be, right? I mean, we're not going to school just to make money, and I think you're right about that. You know, we're going to school to make citizens, and we're going to school to have a public debate. But I don't subscribe to the idea that everybody needs a master's degree. I think that it's a far more diverse. That's something that the higher education institutions would have you believe, the ones that have master's degree programs. And I don't have a master's degree.
Yes.
This question is for Anya. This is something you said very briefly, that at the end of your talk you said people should start to look outside the university rather than expect to have, the logical implication rather than expect to have affordable educations, they should sort of give up on university altogether. I mean, what did you mean by saying people should look outside the university? Americans should expect to have college education?
I think that we need to get back to the basics of what we want from a university education, what the university education is supposed to provide, and really look at how we as a society are going to provide this. And this conversation is not localized to education, okay? It's something that's happening across the board as demographics and just the complexity of a knowledge society and technology and globalization affect every institution in our society. But there are very similar parallel tracks to what's going on between healthcare and education, which is that there is a cost crisis, there's an access crisis, and there's a quality crisis all at the same time. So the cost crisis, there's runaway increase in costs. There's an access crisis, there are many, many people who are, in the case of healthcare, who deserve healthcare and can't get it. In the case of education, who are qualified to participate and can't get in the door. And that's a global problem. And then you have the issue of quality, and in education, the issue of relevance, that by some tokens, over 60% of grade school students today are going to be employed in careers that do not exist by the time they get out of school. So curricula are not evolving quickly enough, knowledge is not moving fast enough. And I don't think that the public system, the way that we have known it, which was designed, pretty quickly and put up in a matter of decades, I don't think it's equipped to take us into the 21st century. So I think there needs to be really massive radical experimentation for people to figure out how to provide themselves the benefits of knowledge, of skills, content, relationships, the peer relationships, the building, the analysis, and the credentialing that a university is meant to provide. It doesn't mean that we give up on the petitioning the system and resisting, but I think that it's equally important to build the alternatives at the same time.
So then what you're saying is we should look for an obvious solution, which is what other countries are doing. And it's not really a global problem, like China is doing the obvious solution, and it's greatly increasing its college education and college graduate rate right now. And that's putting a lot more money into education. And they have regulations on how high tuitions can get, and they provide a lot of government scholarships, and they provide enrollment expansion, things like that, things that the U.S. used to do and is now cutting back on.
China's
but
really...
Instead of doing this obvious, easy solution, why are you proposing we should just give up on accept a shrinkage of education.
We spend a lot more money per capita on education than China does, and we have a much lower annual growth rate. So we're not in the same position that China is.
Relatively speaking, China is greatly increasing.
Yeah, but we already spend way more than they're spending up to. And the other thing is that their system is not something for us to emulate because they haven't really figured out how to replicate the liberal arts model. They send 150,000 or 300,000 people a year over here because they think our institutions are better. So, I mean, I don't say give up on spending more money on higher education. I think we should try to spend more money on higher education. But the fact of the matter is that tuition has increased at 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation since 1978, and that is not a sustainable pattern.
Stop that and regulate it.
Regulating is not going to keep costs down by itself.
Oh, sorry.
I just have a question, maybe to go back. I picked up in this, in your argument, that the securitization and also in Pamela's argument, that these historical marriages with property and mortgages and education and federal insurance to back banks to go in that direction as well, give capital. You use the word incentive, we might say profit, for their profit motive. And it is with that you were suggesting a correlation or an association, if not a causal relationship between the increase, for example, of education.
Mm-hmm.
It is stunning what that increase is about when controlled for consumer index, all the other indexes. And some people in higher education would say that it has created a corporate structure. It is that increase is funding a corporate structure, which is also restructuring these institutions. But can you say more about this relationship between government backing, the Sally Mae story, and the tuition stuff? And does that parallel what we know about the lucrative practices of banks once they were insured for their own failures?
Yeah, sure.
Government insured.
Absolutely. So in many ways, it's even worse, actually, than what happened with the mortgage market, because what happened with federal student loans was that it was heads I win, tails you lose. The federal government underwrote the loans. The private banks made the loans. If you defaulted, the federal government had to chase you down for the money. And the banks got all of the upside and none of the downside, essentially. The market has always been very complicated and hard for people to understand, but it was mitigated to some extent when President Obama took the banks out of the guaranteed student loan system and created all the money now is coming from the direct loans. So the Education Department is making all federally subsidized student loans directly from itself. And so that ended about $16 billion a year, I think, of subsidies, sort of free money for banks. And that was a really nice move. Sally Mae went from Albert Lord wanted to buy a baseball team to junk bond status within a couple of years. So, and Sally Mae, by the way, although it started as a government-sponsored entity like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, actually took private status in the 2000s because they were making so much money. They were ready to go public by themselves. But then their entire business was eradicated with a stroke of a pen, essentially. And they are left as being servicers or middlemen for the loans, where they just issue the loans and service the loans. And they still make a tidy profit for that, but they're not lining up for the same kind of no downside business that they had before. But at the same time, they created the private loan market. And the private loans are like putting college on your credit card. They're 14% interest loans that very often now require a cosigner in the form of a parent, because the private lenders, who are identical with all the banks that you know and love, the Wells Fargo, the Citibank, they got the message that maybe this party is not going to go on forever, because defaults are going to become so massive that they're actually going to hurt the bottom line of the people that are being defaulted on, who are the creditors. So the cosigning is very, very common now. But I see there was a compromise over the summer, right? The federal student loan interest rate was set to double from 3.4% to 6.8%. And at the last minute, there was a showdown. At the last minute, they kept it for another year at 3.4%, set by the federal government. You guys think it should be 0. It's 0 or 2% in lots of other countries. In exchange for that, they got rid of an exemption for graduate students. They restricted the availability of money in different ways. The overall deal ended up costing students a whole lot more than it saved them. And to me, I see that as the very first inkling of austerity in the loan market, where Congress says, you know what, the education department's on the hook now for almost $1 trillion. They're the ones who have to try to get people to pay it back, and there's a lot of people that ain't going to be able to pay it back, whether or not they sign on to resist the money or they just never make that money that they think they're going to make to be able to pay it back, and they die with that loan on their, on their debts, and no one can collect it. So it's a bubble. It can't pop the way that the mortgage bubble popped, because there's no flipping houses and there's no flipping educations. You can't walk away from an education. You can't put your keys in the mail and walk away. But there is going to be maybe a slow deflation as people sort of struggle under the burdens of this debt for an entire generation. And I think the burden on the economy is just starting to be felt.
Say something about the credit bureaus and credit reporting, because it seems to me that when people are successful as resisting in groups, the retaliation is one by one by one by one, largely in the form of information on the credit reports. And then if employers check the credit reports before they offer someone a job, the person is basically blackballed from working society for the rest of basically for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I'll say something. I find this conversation very interesting, but at the same time, I also want to bring forward the theme of debt resistance, because we're basically talking about the functionality of education, especially university education, for the present system as is. And one of the most important questions we have is that this system as is unjust, unequitable, and must be changed. So the issue that we're facing now with the point that you're saying is that those who are, for a variety of different reasons, refusing to pay or unable to pay, these people need to have a political organization and a support system that could make it possible for them not to be destroyed. And in fact, to make it possible for the way in which the organization of the development of knowledge and education does not function purely as a feed into a system that, as far as I'm concerned, is a system that is destructive not only for individuals but also for humanity. So I think that at this point, it's important for us to get to basics at this matter, because one of the most important questions that I think when I hear the echoes of the populist movement and of Shay's rebellion, and basically what they were saying is the way in which the system has been organized has to be transformed. And the question I would have for us politically is, how can we be sure that the decision to refuse is not an invitation to suicide? And that, I think, is really requires a collective head and creativity that we need to call upon ourselves now at a moment where if I may say so, just one minute. In my question to you, Anya, I looked at these two tendencies that we're facing now. On the one side, the tendency that basically says that for the large bulk of the population in the United States and in many parts of the world, there's going to be a precarious future. I just came back from Greece, and it's not only precarious, but it's a disastrous future. But even if we only get an echo of that story here in the United States, we're in for a very, very disastrous ride for especially young people that I see here. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. The second thing, however, is now the question of the out. There's the exit from this problematic, which is supposed to be the university education. And my sense is that this out is going to be increasingly closed. Mm-hmm. And when that recognition happens, and I'm not sure when that'll happen, it's going to transform our discussions, because our discussions now are based upon the assumption that when you open up the doors of the university, they'll come. Mm-hmm. And what will happen when that assumption ends? And how do we, who want to basically say no more to this, how do we respond? How do we organize ourselves? And that, I think, is really, that's on my front burner now. Mm-hmm. I think it's important for us to think about alternative issues, but let's be sure that we're not spending most of our time trying to save their system.
Mm-hmm. I just want to make a quick suggestion related to what you said about credit bureaus. Why is it that it matters so much what our credit report says? Because you can't be a person in this country without borrowing everywhere you go from big banks. You need to buy a car, you need to borrow, you need to buy a house, you need to borrow, you need a credit card to get in an airplane, you need to borrow. So we got this system where the credit report is our rap sheet, it's our real life permanent record. And the only way out of that I see is, well, you know, people are building things like peer-to-peer lending sites where they're lending money to each other. And it doesn't matter so much what you can see someone's credit history on a site like that, but you also see their story and you see their reason for needing the money and their pledge that they're going to write it, you know, pay it back, and maybe also people that they know that you know, so there's some social capital involved. So there's an alternative to always having to have a credit report and having a credit system. And I think that again, you know, to the extent that people can validate each other outside of what an institution can do as a gatekeeper to decide whether you're in or out, that's where I see the egress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just one last small comment on that. There's already 5 million people who are in default. There's about to be 8 million foreclosed. So there are literally millions, and that doesn't even cover just people struggling with their credit cards, all these things. So there's already a huge number of people who are faced with bad credit. So they're functioning, they're doing things, they're out, they're probably here right now with us, you know. And so I think that people are finding ways that are creative around the credit system. Of course, that may be a luxury because most of the jobs that require a credit check are sort of like scooping ice cream or something like that. So there's definitely a class system that's held in place, at least by that kind of surveillance system.
Yeah.
So, but I think there are also, we think about the 3 major credit bureaus, but there are, as Anya was suggesting, there are other measurements, and people are being more and more creative, and they're coming up with those types of measurements. We in Strike Debt, we've actually talked about this before. What would we do? We might try and create some sort of our own system to measure people, and then in that system, it could be a positive mark if you refuse your student loan, for example.
I think we've almost reached our time limit here, and I just wanted to add something to the comment of George's about out, about the moment of out, and the moment that the system somehow closes its doors, because the fiscal managers or the managers of higher education system in this country are already beginning to do that. And we have a tendency, there's a disease, to see things in nationalistic terms, We have to see the international dimension of this. The major institutions of higher education have already started to offshore themselves in all sorts of ways. When our corporations went offshore, it was because they decided that American wages were too high. Institutions of higher education, I mean, one of their major motivations for going offshore now, as if they needed more motivation, is the student debt crisis. The University of California is always in the forefront of these things. The UC system is now being released from its long-term, at least since the California Master Plan in 1962, is now released from its obligation to accommodate, 10% of the state's high school population. So it's liberating itself from the state, and it's increasingly taking more and more overseas students, and Michigan is doing the same. Some of the top public institutions are beginning to move in this direction. So even if national demand for higher education fell off because of a rising debt burden, it's the global market that will supply the places for these institutions. They know that already. There's an estimated 80% growth in the next decade in the global market in higher education, and each of these institutions is already positioning themselves to survive, not just survive, but to expand and grow and make ends meet and further line the pockets of the senior administrators who run the system and who've gotten, whose bank accounts have gotten very fat over the last decade or so as a result of skyrocketing college costs. So these costs are not going to go down. They're going to continue to rise. They have to rise partly because the institutions are debt leveraged, but also because they can rise. They will rise because they can rise, and they will get more and more applicants from overseas, and they're depending on the rising middle classes of developing countries to fill these seats, whether it's in this country or in the numerous programs and campuses that are being set up overseas. So I just wanted to add that because there is this international dimension that's very important, and we have to think beyond our borders here, as always, because we always have to remind ourselves that it's necessary to do that. I want to thank all the panelists for really invigorating